Once, in the hands of rock legends like John Bonham of Led Zeppelin, Ginger Baker of Cream, and Phil Collins, premier drums roared across stages and stadiums. Every kick, every snare, every cymbal hit carried the sound of Britain itself, sturdy, bold, unmistakable. Yet today, the echo of those drums survives only in memory. Factories gone. Machines silenced. The brand outsourced, stripped of its soul. Not through one catastrophe, but through a long retreat of quiet decisions, slow mismanagement, and cultural shifts that no one fully controlled. This is the story of Albert Della Porta, the man who built premier percussion from a cold basement into a thundering empire, and how the sound that once defined rock music gradually faded into silence. Albert Della Porta started with nothing at all. Just a small bag of money saved from years of grinding work in a factory, a bare basement in Tottenham that was freezing in winter and stifling in summer, and a restless obsession with drums that consumed his every waking moment. His fingers itched to carve wood and shape the perfect shell. His ears ached for the perfect snare sound that he could hear in his dreams but not yet create with his hands. Neighbors complained about the hammering late into the night, the endless experimentation that disturbed their sleep. No one knew him in London's music scene. No one invested in his dream. There were no contacts, no wealthy backers, no factory owners willing to take a chance on a poor man with big ideas, only raw ambition and stubborn determination. Albert would take broken drum kits that others had discarded, strip them down to their basic components, rebuild them from scratch, and experiment endlessly with every aspect of their construction. Each strike of the mallet, each drumhead tightened by his own hands, each small adjustment to the bearing edge whispered of something better, something purer, something that could change how drums sounded forever. The world of music was about to meet a new voice, forged in a cold basement by a man who refused to accept failure, one strike at a time. But even then, in those early days of struggle and doubt, he could not have imagined how high his creation would climb, or how far it would eventually fall. The early workshop was tiny and cramped, unbearably hot in summer and freezing in winter, with a single window that barely leaked light onto the dust-covered floor wherewith shavings and metal scraps accumulated daily. Beside Albert worked a half-deaf engineer named Arthur Kingsley, a man who had found his way to this basement workshop seeking refuge from a world that had largely given up on him. Arthur could barely hear the high frequencies that most people took for granted, but he could feel vibrations through his fingertips with an uncanny sensitivity that seemed almost magical. Together, working late into nights and across weekends, Albert and Arthur experimented relentlessly with shell thickness, bearing edges, lacquers, and wood selections. They learned that drums could speak differently, could sound richer and deeper, if touched with genuine care and attention to detail. Wood smelled sweet in that basement, like pine resin mixed with varnish, creating a scent that would become forever associated with their work. Metal hoops glinted under a swinging lamp that cast dancing shadows across their workspace. The first premier sound came not from theory or instruction manuals, but from endless trial and error, from scraping shells, hammering metal, and listening until their fingers bled and their ears rang with the echoes of thousands of strikes. Every drum leaving that tiny room carried the imprint of their obsession, the unmistakable mark of craftsmen who would accept nothing less than perfection, and a hint that something bigger, something revolutionary, was coming. By the 1950s, Albert had managed to establish a small factory in South London, a modest but serious step up from the basement that had launched his dream. The floor hummed with new energy and possibility. Young workers, some barely out of school, carried finished drums across wooden planks with pride. Saws buzzed constantly, creating the unmistakable soundtrack of production. Lathes whirred with mechanical precision, shaping wood into the curves and dimensions that premier drums required. A sweet scent of fresh cut wood mixed with the sharp tang of shellac, creating an atmosphere that inspired confidence in anyone who walked through the doors. The first endorsements came quietly at first, spreading through word of mouth in London's music community. Local bands began to swap their cheap, poorly made kits for premier snares that actually sounded good. Word spread slowly at first, then faster, moving from one musician to another, carried by players who understood quality when they heard it. Soon, talented musicians started to visit the factory, nodding with approval at what they found. Albert's drums were not just instruments that made noise, they were statements of intent, tools for artists who refused to compromise on quality. The factory was still small by any measure, still raw and unpolished in many ways, but it pulsed with genuine possibility and the energy of people who believed they were creating something important. And somewhere beneath it all, lurking almost invisibly, the faint shadow of a future decline had begun to form, though no one could see it yet. By the 1960s, premier drums were defining an entire generation and shaping the sound of rock music itself. British rock exploded across the world with an intensity that surprised everyone. Bands crisscrossed the country, their drummers smashing premier kits on stages where the crowd roared with approval and recognition. Beatles roadies whispered to each other about the perfect snare sound they heard on tracks. Rolling Stones fans could identify a premier kick by sound alone, even on recordings where the drums were buried in the mix. Inside the factory, the culture mirrored the music that their products helped create. Workers joked with each other over lunch, sharing stories and dreams. Apprentices proudly carried freshly finished shells to inspection tables, knowing that they had created something real and important. Occasionally, a famous musician would stroll past the benches, maybe John Bonham or another legend, nodding with approval at the precision, the visible care. The smell of varnish and warm was so thick in the air you could taste it. It was a moment of genuine triumph and validation. Yet, even as the drums thundered in arenas across the world, Albert noticed new pressures bearing down on the company, rising costs, bigger orders that stretched resources, expectations that the relatively small factory might not be able to handle. Not through one catastrophe, but through a long convergence of small tensions accumulating slowly, the first whispers of trouble began to echo through the workshops. By the early 1970s, Premier Percussion had reached its absolute summit, the highest point of success and recognition. Exports flooded the United States and Europe, spreading British drum craftsmanship across the Atlantic and beyond. The Queen's Award for Export Achievement hung proudly in the office, a testament to years of dedicated work and international recognition. The factory had grown and evolved into a purpose-built marvel in South London, a real manufacturing facility that was purpose-designed rather than improvised. Hundreds of workers labored under high ceilings, ventilated only by large iron fans that pushed hot air around in summer and struggled against the cold in winter. Rock stars dropped by casually to visit and inspect the operation, and Phil Collins sometimes played the drums right in the testing hall, much to the delight and amazement of the workers who stopped their labor to watch a legend at work. Every inch of the factory showcased vertical integration, from shell shaping to varnish application, from precise tuning to final packaging. All of it happened under one roof, all of it controlled by the company that understood every aspect of the process. Albert watched the empire grow with a sense of satisfied accomplishment. He smiled at the orders that arrived, at the sight of full truckloads heading out the gates to record labels and concert halls around the world. But even in triumph, the pattern repeated itself in his mind, not through one catastrophe, but through a slow, almost imperceptible shift that would one day unseat them and return them to nothing. The factory at its peak was alive in every sense of the word. Smells of warm wood, solder flux, and fresh lacquer mingled together, creating an atmosphere that was unmistakably a place of creation. A metallic tang from plating chemicals hung faintly in the air, a reminder of the precision engineering that went into every component. The soundscape was relentless and almost musical, staples thwacking into place, lathes buzzing with mechanical precision, snare wires rattling in testing stands as they were checked for quality and resonance. Workers moved with genuine pride in their work, understanding that what they made mattered. Apprentices learned to strike shells properly, to tune them to perfection, to polish them until they shined. Finished drums were stacked carefully, waiting for the truck that would carry them to musicians around the world. Albert walked the aisles regularly, his hands behind his back, listening to the symphony of creation that surrounded him, the collective effort of dozens of skilled people working toward excellence. Even at its height, there was a quiet understanding among those who worked there that success was fundamentally fragile and temporary. Every machine, every pair of hands, every strike of a drum carried the weight of a legacy that could not last forever, that was built on foundations that might shift. The late 1970s brought change that was felt before it was fully understood. Corporate buyers sniffed opportunity in the market and began circling. The factory was no longer just Albert's personal dream and vision, it became a line item in a larger portfolio, a unit of production in a larger equation. Profits that should have been reinvested in the factory and its workers were siphoned away to other projects that had nothing to do with drums. Pressure grew from new management to cut costs wherever possible, to expand too quickly without proper planning, to compromise the craft that had made Premier special. Whispers ran through the workshops like a cold wind. Arthur Kingsley, the old engineer who had worked beside Albert from the beginning, noticed that new managers didn't care if a shell sounded slightly flat or imperfect. Junior workers heard rumors circulating that new materials from overseas might replace British maple, that shortcuts were being considered. Pride began to yield to efficiency and profit margins. Not through one catastrophe, but through a long retreat from the standards and ideals that had once defined them, the company began to lose its way. By the 1980s, Premier began outsourcing production in earnest, spreading the work to factories overseas where labor was cheaper and regulations were looser. Solid-state snares began to replace hand-wired kits that had been the signature of the brand. Cheaper plastics crept into shells that had previously been made from quality wood. Japanese drum manufacturers pressed in aggressively with bright, precise machines that could mass-produce drums faster than any British handcraft could possibly match. Each new owner that took control of the company stripped a little more away from what made Premier special. British-made gradually became imported. Hand-lacquered became sprayed. Arthur Kingsley had passed away quietly by this time, leaving a void in craftsmanship that could never be filled because his knowledge and experience could not be replaced. The sound that once defined an entire era faded slowly, not in one dramatic strike, but over years of neglect and poor decisions. Musicians who had grown up playing Premier drums could hear the difference immediately, could feel the quality decline with every strike of the drumhead. The early 1990s brought the inevitable conclusion that had been approaching for years. The council issued demolition orders for the aging South London factory, deciding that the space would be better used for something else. Distributors failed, one after another, unable to sell drums that no longer had the reputation they once enjoyed. Bankruptcy loomed as an unavoidable reality. Albert, now old and quiet and tired, faced the painful decision that he never wanted to make: close the doors and end the dream. Machines were sold off to scrap dealers and other manufacturers. Shells sat unfinished, abandoned on workbenches. Apprentices were sent home, told not to come back. The energy that had once defined the place drained away like water from a broken vessel. Not through one catastrophe, but through a slow degradation of everything that had once been vibrant and proud, Premier Percussion's heart stilled completely. The factory was torn down by bulldozers and construction crews who had no idea what they were destroying. A retail park replaced the hum of lathes and the sweet scent of warm wood that had filled the air for decades. Rust claimed the tools that had once been revered and carefully maintained. Not a plaque marked the site. Not a memorial acknowledged what had been built and lost. Workers dispersed, scattered across the country to find new work, new lives, their stories and experiences mostly unrecorded and forgotten. The sound lingered only in memory, fragile and fading with each passing year. A ghost of music past, echoing faintly in old recordings and studio sessions, a reminder of a time when British manufacturing meant something real. Today, Premier exists in name alone, a hollow label on products manufactured far from Britain. Cheap, mass-produced kits made in factories with no connection to Albert's vision or Arthur's dedication carry the brand name on their cases and shells. The craftsmanship is hollow, a shadow of what it once was. The scent of varnish, the feel of warm wood under fingertips, the pride of a hand-finished snare that sounded perfect, these are all gone. The brand continues to exist in the marketplace, carried by inertia and fading reputation, but its soul does not. Not through one catastrophe, but through decades of erosion and poor decisions, the heritage has become a shadow, a ghost of its former self. And yet, there is a memory that refuses to fade completely. In old recordings, and videos of stages where legends played, and the echoes of drummers who learned on Premier kits and carried the sound forward into their own careers, the sound survives. The stubbornness of Albert Della Porta, the dedication of Arthur Kingsley, the hands of hundreds of workers across generations, all live in the timbre of each drum that still sings in studios and basements and on stages around the world. British manufacturing may falter and stumble, empires may crumble under the weight of poor decisions, factories may vanish and be replaced by retail parks. But a sound, carefully forged through years of experimentation and care, refuses to die completely. Not through one catastrophe, but through slow degradation and corporate neglect, it carries the soul of those who built it and believed in it. The world remembers Premier not for the supermarket that replaced its factory, nor for the cheap imports sold under its name in music stores. It remembers the sound, the resonance of wood and metal, the echo of hands and hearts, and a stubborn dream that once thundered across Britain and the world, inspiring countless musicians to believe that their art mattered.